Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah. V'arevna Adonai Eloheinu divrei Toratcha b'finu b'fi abcha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tze'etzeinu v'tze'etzei abcha beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai l'mei Torah l'amo Yisrael.
Amen.
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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'chabanu mikol hamim v'natan lanu torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so we don't have any halacha to learn because for some reason I never got that the email from Rabbi Daniel Brody, but we've got a lot to do in the Gemara, so I think let's just focus on that at the moment to see if we can have a little bit of headway. So just in summary, what we learned in a couple of sentences was as follows. Is Rabbi Yehuda said, there's a mechanism at which an animal becomes MUAD. If it does the aggressive behavior and injures on 3 separate days. And therefore, in order to become tam and revert back to the relaxed status at which it's not paying full damages from choice property and it's now paying half damages from the body of the animal, it has to desist from the behavior also on 3 separate days. In other words, whatever caused it to become muad has to be remedied in the same manner, both in the 3 occurrences and on 3 separate days. So it uses the word separate and not consecutive because it's over a period of time. What I'd like to do, as I said, is clarify with Rabbi Cohen, what sort of time period are we looking at? Because Gavin mentioned actually a very good point yesterday. If it's over a period of like years, is this even considered an aggressive animal? I mean, what is our cutoff period? So I'd actually be interested to find out. And unfortunately, with my non-existent Aramaic skill, I can't look up the Tosfot or Rashi. I can only use Schottenstein and other sources. And although I could probably scrounge for it, an expert like Rabbi Cohen would be able to find it in 2 seconds. So that would be an interesting part. The other aspect to bear in mind is Rabbi Meir's opinion, which was contrary to that, said that he agrees that if a muad is an animal that they've testified about, that it is done 3 times. But when he says 3 times, he doesn't hold it to be on 3 separate days. He said even if the occurrence occurs in a single day, that certainly makes sure it's obligated because he doesn't work on days. He works a number of times, okay? And it reverts to being tam, back to the normal status of calm. The minute any time children poke at it between the horns and it does, okay. So on this particular basis, the Gemara obviously certainly feels that you can see the difference of remedy would seem to be, so far what we learn is that it would revert to being a time if it desisted only 1 time, any time, from children poking it. And I'm assuming children are more likely to get the animal riled up. So I will just check with Rabbi Cohen again if desisting from the behavior of an animal being irritated by an animal would occur only 1 time according to Rabbi Meir in order to get it to revert back to a tam status, or that's only with children. But I'm assuming it would get it to go back to a tam status because it used the term children to say if an animal would aggravate it, children would aggravate it even more so. Let me tell you what the premise of that is that if there's a bully that's 6'4" and built like a brick house and would aggravate me, I would maybe have in 2 months not to literally irritate him because he would squash me or at least injure me. So whereas somebody half my size, if he's irritating me, I don't have that self-preservation thought process going on, and therefore I'd have no qualms about telling him to go jump in the lake. So the thing of it is, an animal when posed by irritating children that would desist wouldn't have any sort of feelings of self-preservation. And if it would remain calm when it had no vested interest to, certainly when an animal would irritate it and it would be on the attack and it calmed down even once, it would seem, according to Rav Meir, that at that stage it would become calm. So again, he agrees to become muad 3 times, but to become calm once. Now, just one thing is that the argument in the Gemara then proceeded and discussed, well, how does Rav Meir actually see that in order for it to become muad, it would need it to be on one particular event, because Gavin was quite sharp yesterday. We know when Gavin's had enough sleep, he's sharp. But when we don't have enough sleep, all of us battle a little bit. So what he said yesterday is he also brought up a very good point. And it was quite sharp, because I know he hadn't done Chazorah. So that made it extremely sharp. It's not like he read ahead. So one of the concepts that he hit that was quite good was he discussed this issue of, well, how do you know that the animal wasn't just having a bad day? When we're all sleep deprived, we're more ratty that particular day. And we're more likely, if we're not feeling well and sleep deprived, to be able to be short-tempered with everybody. So who's to say that if an ox behaved badly on one particular day, it's necessarily indicative of its nature, which is a good point. And the Gemara brings up the same point, and it says, well, how are you thinking this? So Rav Meir says as follows: listen, if you're establishing that an animal that loses its cool and injures at longer intervals is considered an aggressive animal. Kal v'chomer, even more so, if it gets aggressive at shorter intervals, it's even more indicative of the animal being uncontrollable. Okay. And what happens is the rabbis then return with the statement saying as follows. So it's saying, look, we've got a source to prove that what you're saying here is not correct. Your kal v'chomer doesn't work. And where does it bring it from? Guys, do you remember? You don't have to give me the sourcing, just give me the concept.
The Zav thing.
Yes, the Zava, specifically the Zava. We are going to discuss the Zav today, but the Zava talks about clean processes and purities and impurities on basically the basis of a number of days, and not the number of occurrences or the frequency of the event. Does that make sense? So we're going to go through that now. We're just going to go through a summary. The one thing that you also need to establish is, how do we get this 3 separate days? So we got that 3 separate days in the Mishnah from Shemot to Exodus chapter 21, verse 36, which says, but if it became known that it was a goring bull from yesterday and before yesterday, yet its owner did not guard it, that's where we get the verse. So how did there's a discussion between Abaya's interpretation of Rav Yehuda and Rava's interpretation of Rav Yehuda. And Abaya says, listen, if we say the word today, it's one day. If we say, listen, I was a vegetarian like from yesterday and the 9 days, it means 2 days. If I say from before yesterday, that implies 3 days. Does that make sense? So that's Abaya's opinion and the general consensus. Rava turns around and says the word from has no significance here. So the word from, if I use the word from yesterday, he counts it as 1 full day. And the word from yesterday and before, he counts that as 2 days. So basically, the interpretation generally on that is on the 3rd goring, the animal becomes muad, because after 2 occurrences, it's already done, being warned, etc., etc. And Abaya says, Rav Yehuda says, it needs 3 particular warnings or occurrences and being warned after that. And then on the 4th occurrence, subsequently, the person is liable to full payment from choice property being muad. So there was this discussion with Rashi and Tosfot, and then Tosfot disagrees with Rashi's explanation of Rava and says, listen, that's not the way that you interpret Rava. In fact, halachically, there's no practical difference, because according to Tosfot's explanation of Rava, he's saying, yes, you do say there are different incidents, but he doesn't determine it means 2. He says it's 3, but you become muad on the 3, but you only have to, after the 3, but you only have to pay the muad damage after the 4. So Tosfot doesn't agree with Rashi's explanation of Rava, which says after 2 times the animal becomes muad on the 3rd time. Rashi looks at it literally. Tosfot says that eventually the Gemara mentions that Rashi seemed to retract that statement that it was only 2 days. We'll never know. We'll never know. So that's the discussion. So back to this discussion as far as the Zava is concerned and how this breaks down the Kol V'chomer. So this breaks down the Kol V'chomer as follows. It's saying, Rav Meir says, if where a bull spread it 3 gorings over 3 days, its owner is liable to the full damages of Muad. Then, when it concentrated its gorings into 1 day, is it not certain that he is liable to full damages? Meaning because the intensity is far more concentrated. So so Rav Meir obviously agrees with Rav Yehuda that the scriptural case of Muad involves an animal that is gored on 3 successive days. He's got no problem saying that he agrees with Rav Yehuda, but what he's saying is it certainly does also apply if those 3 occurrences happened in 1 day. His view is on the number of occurrences. So it's not like he's arguing with Rav Yehuda, because Rav Yehuda is again saying 3 occurrences, but the only difference is Rav Yehuda is saying it was on 3 consecutive days. So again, Rav Meir agrees with Rav Yehuda, but he's saying something slightly different. He's saying if those occurrences occur in 1 day, even more so that the animal is uncontrollable and therefore muad, which Rav Yehuda doesn't agree with, because he says you need a certain number of days to establish a habitual pattern. Now, the rabbis argue with Rabbi Meir, and they say, look, if you look at the law of Zava, this demonstrates the fallacy of your Kol V'chomer, okay? Because if she spread out her 3 discharges of blood over 3 days, she is tameh, she's impure. But if she concentrated her 3 discharges in 1 day, she is tahor. Obviously, she'd have to go to the mikveh that night and then only have to observe 1 clean day. So what it's saying is, listen, this exact, what we're trying to hear, what has the Zava got to do, for example, with whether an ox is muad or tam?
Sorry, Dame. Why don't you just repeat this? That 3 thing. This is the Zav. Sorry, just say that again.
Okay, I will. The only thing of it is I wanted to explain to you, Michael, what the Zava actually has to do with the animal being muad. Because you could say, what does the one have to do with the other? Sure. I mean, you could say they're 2 different discussions. What we're trying to establish here is what halachically determines a pattern. Is it the number of times something is done, or the number of days that form a habit? And that's what we're trying to do, even if the subject matter is different. If we're able to derive halacha from that sort of habitual pattern, we're trying to pick up other sources of a habitual pattern within the Gemara. That's why I'm using the example.
Okay, sure.
So I'm going to repeat.
Can I just ask?
Yeah, okay.
Damon, can I just ask something?
Sure.
To me, the logic again of that all in 1 day, besides the fact that it's a guy could be ox could be having a bad day, there's another aspect as well, is that just logically you can basically become muad and tam all in 1 day then, in theory.
No, because
in that case, why? You could be caught 3 times.
You asked me. I'm explaining.
Sorry. Okay.
Half a sec. I think it is a good point, because what Gavin's saying just initially when you look at it is you do the occurrence in 1 day and then you assist. But what happens is if you do the occurrence, you have to be warned. There have to be witnesses. Does that make sense? There has to be due process. So the minute your animal creates drama, if you've ever had a car accident, it's unlikely a person has a car accident twice in 1 day. The minute that happens, your nerves are shot. You've got to go to the police station. You've got to report it. you believe me, you're not in the mood to drive that particular day. It's basically a day ender. You've got a lot of logistical work to deal with that particular injury. So it doesn't occur within the same day. You have to be officially warned. There have to be witnesses. It's not going to transpire over the same day, where the animal is going to cause the incident to revert back to tam in the same day, necessarily. Because there has to be what you call a separation of day. Meaning, let me just give you an example of what I mean, Kabb, is that even if the animal goes rogue and creates an incident, 3 bad incidents in one day, that is possible. But is just like if a zav has a seminal emission 3 times in one day, you don't become pure in the same day. You need a halachic day to transpire before you can go to the mikveh or before you can register as a particular day of cleanliness. Let me just give you an example with the fast. Can I give you an example with the fast? So say, for example, you have to fast on the 10th of Tevet, right? And you break your fast. You can't break Shabbos and then keep Shabbos and say you haven't broken Shabbos. There's no such concept. You can't break a fast and then resume the fast on the same day and say you've kept the fast.
Yeah, got it. Thanks, Damon.
Am I making sense or did I not answer correctly? I'm listening if you don't feel like that.
That's a great example.
Yeah. It's a good example, and also the Zava example is very good.
Okay, but yeah. So all right. So that Shabbos one is probably pretty clean. You break it, you don't suddenly resume it when you decide not to.
Yeah.
You've got to keep another Shabbos intact for full Shabbos to be kept. All right, good.
Yeah.
Good question. So let me just repeat this for Michael just to explain what we're talking about here. So the rabbis want to break that kol v'chomer because they're saying it's not based on sourcing. Because the law of the Zava is as follows, okay? Basically, a Zava is a woman who discharges uterine blood during the 11 days following her 7-day nida period of normal menstruation. If during this 11-day period she discharges blood on just 1 or 2 consecutive days, she is tameh. She's impure, but she can immerse herself in a mikveh to become tahor, pure, after observing only 1 clean day, to answer Gavin's question also. Okay? So in other words, 1 day without any discharge of blood. Right. So such a woman is called a Zava Katana, which is a minor Zava, because she's able to return to a status of purity if she has 1 clean day and then goes to the mikveh. Okay, and a woman who observes a day free of discharge against the day on which she discharges blood. So the one cancels out the other, as long as it's not for 3 times. It could be 1 or 2 consecutive days, but 1 clean day discharges the record. If, however, she discharges blood on 3 consecutive days during the 11 days of Ziva, she becomes a Zava Gadola, which is a major Zava, and she must count 7 clean days before she can immerse herself again. So she must also bring a pair of bird offerings following her purification. So I don't know if you see the process, Marco, of how that works before I explain what the rabbi's objection is.
I understand what you're saying. I'll hear how you're relating it, how you'll relate it.
All right. So basically, the rabbi is saying, look, it's no good just turning around and say if the animal created 3 injuries and hazards in 1 particular day, that it's indicative of it being more aggressive than if the goring is spread out over 3 separate days of occurrences. Because if we use the Zava as an example to establish habitual pattern, we see there that even if a woman has, for example, 1 or 2 menstrual unclean days, after her neder period, there's 11 days at which she's meant to be clear in a clean state. But if she still discharges for 1 or 2 days, it's not the end of the world. She's a minor Zava, and she can then observe one clean day. And if she has one clean day, she can go to the mikvah and she returns to a pure state, right? So what this is proving is that even on the one day, if she has three, what do you call it?
Discharges.
Yeah, three blood uterine discharges, and it all occurs in a single day. But then she has a clean day afterwards, she can go to the mikveh and she's pure. So this proves that to have a more concentrated form of discharges in one particular day doesn't establish any sort of halachic habituation in any way. Otherwise, she couldn't become pure. The only way she can be,
You're saying it doesn't prove the intensity of the problem. It just because the following day she just has to observe one clean day. She's fine.
Yes, they're saying even more than that. They're saying not only does it not even prove that she's more in a state of impurity, they're saying, in fact, if the three discharges happen on the same day, she can go to the mikveh after one clean day and she's pure. It doesn't establish anything. Never mind more intense. And the Bava Kamma doesn't work at all, because what is needed to establish habitual behavior is the number of days, as well as the number of occurrences. So they say it's not. She's only a major zava, a zava gedolah, if it's on three separate days that she has discharges. Then she has to go to the. Then she has to observe 7 clean days, and ensure that a mikveh is done with the bird offering, etc. So it's the amount of days, in addition to the event that causes those days to be counted, that creates the habitual nature. Not the intensity.
It's like if you have a cold in the one day, you may be sick, but if you have a cold for 3 days, you've probably got flu.
Exactly. That's exactly it. You sneeze 5 times in a row on the one day, it doesn't mean you've got the bubonic plague. It means you've got a pollen attack or allergic to that furry mutt that you've been raising, that dog of yours. So, whereas exactly as Michael said, if you on a number of days seem to develop the continual sneezing and sniffles, that's indication of a flu, not of hay fever or minor cold. That's exactly. So what they're saying is your Bava Kamma doesn't seem to work in this particular case, because it says if she spread out her 3 discharges of blood over 3 days, she is tamei, impure. But if she concentrated her 3 discharges in one day, she is tahor, pure, after going to the mikveh. So Rav Meir has to now respond to them. So what is Rav Meir's response to them? He basically says, what's the case here? Surely it states, and this shall be his tumah when he discharges. Scripture has thus made the zav dependent on discharges and the zava on days. Okay? So what it's basically saying is, if you have a look in Leviticus, I think in Leviticus is Vayikra, chapter 15, verse 3, regarding the male zav. The male zav becomes tamei through certain types of seminal discharge. So 2 discharges require him to count 7 clean days before he can purify himself through immersion in spring water. And then 3 discharges make him liable to a pair of bird offerings upon his purification as well. So this verse with the male zav makes no mention of days. It contains the word zav, discharge, 3 times, from which we derive that 3 discharges render the person a fully fledged zav, even if it's all on the same day. Okay, so what he's saying is, all right, so you're using this example of the zavat. I'm using the example of the zav. So if you want to look at the male pattern of what you call being spiritually impure, it happens twice in one day. He has to go to the mikveh and observe 7 clean. He has to observe 7 clean days and then go to the mikveh. If it happens 3 times even in one day, he then has to bring a pair of bird offerings as well. So there, we're talking about number of discharges and not the number of days. So if I'm talking about you, the Zav, and you're talking about the Zava, who's to say yours is more important necessarily than mine? Both have got scriptural sourcing. Mine's in Leviticus, yours is in Exodus.
But they differ, right? You're saying they differ. I mean,
they differ. I'm saying they
the
differ.
Zav's getting more it's more punitive for the Zav in this case.
Yes. So what he's saying is there's no ways that you necessarily only establish a habitual pattern based on the number of days. You can establish it based on the number of occurrences, because he said if a male Zav has 3 discharges in a single day, he not only has to wait for 7 complete days and go to the mikveh, but he also has to bring her bird offerings. And if it's 2 discharges in a single day, doesn't have to bring the bird offerings, but 7 complete days and then the mikveh. So in that particular case, we see that can occur in the same day, and that shows also frequency and intensity. Doesn't have to be the number of days. So now we had a bit of a, what do you call it, a bit of a loss. Who's right? Do we go on the male Zav to establish pattern or the female Zavah? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does everybody understand the discussion?
Yeah,
right. Okay, so that's clear. So I'm just going to read forward. So Scripture has thus made the Zav dependent on discharges and the Zav on days. So the Gemara questions this last exposition. How do you know that this expression and this comes to exclude a Zava from assuming that status through discharges alone? Say rather that it comes to exclude a Zav from assuming that status through 3 discharges on 3 separate days. Okay, so what it's trying to say here is it's trying to say that there's a phrase and this, okay? And when it uses the word and this, what it's trying to say is that he basically, how do I put it in a very simple way without getting complicated? All right. All right. So what it wants to say is, how do you know with the Zava that it doesn't also work on the, how do you know with the Zava it can't necessarily work on the number of days? Or how do you know then, how do you work it the other way around? How do you know with the Zav it doesn't work on the amount of days either? So let me just repeat the phrase to say, just to see if I've got it clear. How do you know that this expression and exclude a Zava from assuming that stated through discharges alone? Say rather that it comes to exclude a Zav from assuming that status through 3 discharges on separate days. Okay, so I'm a little bit confused here. I just want to see if I can get some clarity because that statement isn't making sense. So there's a discussion by Rabbeinu Peretz that says perhaps, and the statement and this means that this is the only way one becomes a Zav, through closely spaced discharges. But one does not become a Zav in the manner of Zava through discharges on successive days. Okay, so what it's saying is if it can be proved that the Zav also becomes impure over a successive number of days, then we've got more in favor of the amount of days than the amount of successive events. Does that make sense? In other words, if a Zav can only be infected because of the frequency of the event and the number of discharges compared to the number of days, and a woman only about a number of days, then we add a bit of a standoff position. I don't know why the Gemara words it in a complicated way, but basically there's an expression bezot, and this and this. So it indicates that the laws contained in the verse apply specifically to that very context, but not to another context. Okay, so what it's saying here, sorry, I was just reading the Hebrew, is that when it ever uses the term and this, it's an exclusionary term. What do we mean by an exclusionary term? if I say to you, Kevin, I want you to bring this particular document to our offices while we're doing work. If I say in this, I'm excluding that. If I say I want you to take this and not that, it's an exclusionary term. It means I want something specific as opposed to everything else. So when the Torah uses the term vazot in this, it includes that it wants to have a certain exclusion. So the female Zava does not assume her status through discharges alone, but rather her discharges must take place on 3 consecutive days, mentioned in the verse that discusses her laws. That's according to Rashi. So Rav Meir replies that his notion is indeed correct. Behavior repeated at shorter intervals is a stronger indication of pattern than behavior repeated at longer intervals. Therefore, the reason Kol V'chomer would indeed dictate that if a woman became a major Zava through discharges on 3 consecutive days as stated in the verse, then certainly she becomes a Zava through 3 discharges on 1 or 2 days. Nevertheless, the special scriptural derivatives, vazot, and this comes to instruct us not to apply the Kol V'chomer in this case, but to restrict the conditions of the major Zava to 3 days mentioned in her context. All right, so what it's saying is as follows. I'm just going to make this very easy to understand. What Rabbi Meir is saying is as follows, is that a woman, Zava, would indeed become impure if she had 3 discharges in one particular day. There's a special scriptural verse, vazot, and this, which means the standard application of behavioral determinism is removed on the number of successive events and rather attaches it to a certain amount of days where those events have to transpire. But if there wasn't that scriptural source, the automatic conclusion would be the Kol V'chomer. Just like the male Zav, if the more discharges occur in a shorter period of time, the quicker the male becomes what you call impure and infected, the quicker the female would also become impure and infected. Without that biblical phrase, vazot, that phrase is an exclusionary phrase and means to say that a woman, Zava, can only become impure on separate days. And without that special verse, we would be able to apply the Kol V'chomer. So what he's basically saying to the rabbis is, you can't use the reason of the Zava because it's got its own special scriptural wording and law, but that doesn't establish habit, because without that, a woman would be subject to the number of frequencies and not separated by the male. And it's for her benefit that it does this so she can have relations with her husband. That's why there's a special edict by the merciful one to allow for such a thing. Okay.
So you're saying we follow the Zav then, the 3 consecutive days.
So what it's
and not the Zava, which is the 3 on 1 day. So am I wrong?
Okay, so what we're saying is as follows. If we compare a female Zava to a male Zav as well, we can arrive at the following conclusion. Just as a male Zav becomes tamei or impure through several discharges, even if they're on the same day, so too a female Zava can become tamei, impure, through 3 discharges, even if they're all on the same day. And then the Gemara says that can't be, because the merciful one in his Torah has stated the exclusionary term, and this, which as explained, serves to restrict the conditions of the female Zava to 3 days stated in her passage in order to become pure, impure. So the Gemara then asks, I'm going to get you now, Michael, and what compelling reason do you see to construe the verse this way around and the other way around? So what it's saying is, Rabbi Meir's argument is that a woman would be subject to exactly the same laws as men in terms of the number of discharges without a special scriptural edict of an exclusionary term, meaning her discharges alone don't count unless it's attached to the number of days. So he's saying that doesn't prove that the